Chanah's journey. Chanah and her family are crossing the Atlantic Ocean to begin a new life in America. Her parents, Rivka and Yankel, and her brother, Benjamin, are traveling with cousins Brazil, Yakov, and Shmuel, and grandmother, Tante Mima. Chanah is sad because Pitzel, the cat she found before they boarded, has escaped from her basket. Chanah and Yakov last saw Pitzel in the third-class deck, where they made friends with a woman with a feather in her hat. If Chanah leaves the ship with Pitzel, she will never see her again. As the ship nears land, the family wonders if they will pass inspection because Yakov is deaf. A ship's officer who knows the secret has written a note for the inspectors at Ellis Island. The next morning, they awoke to an awful din. Eager to find out what all the commotion was about, Chanah's family ran out on the deck in an awkward cluster, banging into other people, even knocking over a cooking pot and a checkerboard. Each one holding the hand of the other, they quickly saw that everything was veiled in an early morning mist as dense as steam from a kettle. Then something wondrous appeared. To their left, rising before them, stood a giant statue of a woman holding aloft a torch in one hand and clutching a book in the other. Rays like spokes on a wheel poked from her head. Tante Mima tried to cover Chanah's eyes. "Don't look," she said. "She's in her nightgown." "If the Americans want to put a Statue of Liberty in a nightdress," said Yankel, "it's their business." Everyone in steerage began to shout at the same moment. Some began to cry. Parents picked up babies and small children and held them up to see the lady with the torch. Chanah felt as if the lady were looking right at her. She did not really believe it, but it was nice to pretend until Benjamin spoiled it by saying that he was only made of copper. Things happened quickly after that. A booming gun salute was fired from the island to her right. Crewmen ran shouting among the passengers in steerage hold with orders for all people to wear their tickets in plain sight. The men fastened them to their caps, women to their dresses. Then, carrying bills of lading in their trembling hands, the steerage passengers gathered on deck their bundles, trunks, boxes, baskets, while the passengers on the upper decks threw down coins or waved to people waiting on the wharf. "Don't pick up their pennies," warned Yankel. "Soon we will be richer than rich," said Rivka. "We'll settle for a roof over my head and a floor that doesn't rock." They were poked and shoved onto a long line that led down a gangplank, where they were herded into waiting ferries. At this moment, Yakov's mother thought she saw her husband, Shimson, waiting on the wharf. She began to wave to a man who waved back, but before she could be certain, she was rudely shoved along with everyone else into a ferry. "Wave to your father, Shmuel," she shouted. "Where?" asked Shmuel. "I don't see him." "Why do you tell them that the man is Shimson?" asked Rivka, "when you are not sure, when you cannot even see his face?" "It will help to have something good to think about," replied Yakov's mother, "while we wait in that place." She pointed in the direction of Ellis Island, to which they were headed. Chanah paid attention to none of this. She was taking one last look at the ship that had been her home for the last 2 weeks. If there was any hope of ever seeing Pitzel again, it would be gone the minute she stepped foot on the ferry. Her deep sigh went unheard when passengers suddenly began to tug and shout as their baggage was torn from them and thrown into the ferry's lower deck. Most had not been separated from their possessions since they had left their homes, and having their personal belongings yanked from their hands was an unsettling experience. For Chanah's family, it was less so, mainly because they had so little of value. Whatever was important, like the silver cups, the brass candlesticks, and gold coins, was carried on their persons. Chanah wondered about the woman from third class. Did she have to go to Ellis Island? Did they tug the luggage from her hands too? "Where are we going now?" asked Tante Mima. "Are they sending us back already?" "Not back, Mama," replied Yankel. "Just to Ellis Island." "What for?" asked Tante Mima. "To look us over, make sure that we are fit to enter." He said this softly so that Yaakov's mother wouldn't have more to worry about than she already had. The ferry ride to Ellis Island was brief, only 15 minutes by Yankel's pocket watch, the time it takes to pluck a chicken, pin feathers and all. As Chanah and her family stepped onto the dock, they were surrounded by guards who looked as if they did not know how to smile, all scowling and gesturing and shouting commands, pulling the immigrants into separate groups, then counting them and shoving them into line when they did not move quickly enough. Chanah and her family were pushed into a red brick building where they climbed a staircase, lugging their bundles and their baskets one step at a time. At the top of the staircase, they were stopped by a team of doctors in long gray coats who inspected their faces, hair, necks, and hands with careful attention to their eyes, then listened to their hearts. Others did not pass inspections and were taken out of line, including the Russian family, who were all being detained to determine if they were carrying a disease. When the doctors finally waved them through, Chanah and her family stepped down another flight of stairs into a great hall. Yaakov and Shmuel and Raziel were right behind them. The conclusion that none of them dared make was that the note from the ship's officer had somehow been lost. The great hall below was divided into a maze of passageways for the immigrants to pass through, clearance lines bound by iron pipe railings with benches to sit on. There, they waited to be called before an inspector who would ask them 29 questions. Everything depended on the answers they gave. Even though they might be prepared, there was always the fear that all-powerful officials would find cause to send one back. Parents could be separated from children, husbands from wives. Everyone had heard of someone who had that experience. Chanah's family moved along a few feet of bench space at a time, and a string of human beads jerking forward one by one. After what seemed like forever, they were next. The first question was directed to Yankel. "Who paid for your fare?" the inspector asked through an interpreter. Yankel straightened his clothes and collarless jacket. "I did," he replied proudly. "Do you have a job waiting for you?" "Yes, in Woodbine, New Jersey. I go to work on a farm." "Is anyone meeting you?" "No." His answer seemed to bother the inspector, who made a note on a piece of paper. Yankel was next. Asked if he and Rivki were married. Rivki, offended, jumped up. "Of course we are married," she shouted. "What do you think we are?" "When and where?" demanded the inspector. Rivki gave him the date and the name of the village. She would have told him more, but Yankel gave her a warning look, and she sat down, her arms angrily crossed. "How much money do you have?" Yankel wanted no unexpected whacks on the head from the thieves in the night. $5 in gold, he whispered. "Show it to me," demanded the inspector. This presented a problem. Should Yankel show his coins, which he had kept so carefully hidden, and risk losing them? Yet without money, they were considered public charges. If the authorities decided that this was so, they would all have to wait in detention rooms from which hardly anyone was released except to be sent back to where they came from. The uncle reluctantly took off his shoes while the inspector and the interpreter laughed. Then each family member was asked his or her name, after which a miracle occurred. The inspector issued landing cards for all of them, including Tante Mima, whose answers were not always on the mark, especially when they asked if she knew where she was, and she replied that she wasn't sure, but it was definitely not Taj Mahal. "Thank you," said Yankel, using up 2 of his 11 English words. Dragging their belongings, they passed through the maze of iron railings. Then they waited on the other side behind a mesh of fence for Yakov, Shemuel, and Raziel, close enough to hear what the inspector was saying to them. Yakov stood before the high bench in his knickers and visored hat. When the inspector asked him his name, his mother stepped forward. "He has a sore throat," she explained. "Not a sickness, just hoarse from calling geese. See, I have wrapped his neck in flannel." "You've been on this ship for 2 weeks," said the inspector, when the interpreter had relayed Raziel's answer. "As far as I know, there was not a goose among you." He laughed at his own joke. Then things took a serious turn. The officials conferred. One stepped behind Yakov and clapped his hands behind Yakov's head. Chanah, who saw this coming, pointed from the fence, and Yakov turned. "He seems to hear all right," said the interpreter. "I'm not sure," said the inspector. He was slow in turning. "Whisper your name, boy. Even with a sore throat, you can whisper." "He wants your name," said the interpreter. Yakov drew an imaginary line down the center of his body, turned in one direction, then another. "What's he doing?" asked the inspector. "Is he having some kind of fit? If that's what he's doing, then the interview's over." Chanah broke from her family, ducked beneath the iron pipe, and ran to the high bench. "I know what he's doing." The inspector leaned over his desk to peer at Chanah. "Who are you to him?" he asked. "He's my cousin. He can talk," insisted Chanah. "He just talks with his hands." "Tell him something else," she said to Yakov. Yakov pointed to the inspector's pocket watch. He made a rippling hand motions, then a pinch of his thumb and forefinger. "He's saying you have a drop of water inside your watch case." The inspector looked. Sure enough, there was a tiny drop of water under his case. "At least we know his eyesight is good," he said. Yankel decided it was time to join the protest. "A different language," he shouted through the mesh, "like all the different languages here. You need an interpreter, that's all." Then the inspector lost his temper. "Get that little girl out of here," he shouted. "Things are getting out of hand. Tell them to be quiet, or we'll send them all back." The inspector appeared to be troubled. He seemed to be thinking. You let in someone who's deaf, and you let in someone who's blind. Where is it all going to end? When the inspector shook his head, no one needed an interpreter to figure out that Yakov would not be permitted to enter. A great scream went up from Raziel, the kind that rattles from the throat and makes all within hearing feel their scalps crawl. Rif began to wail, Yankel to shout. The interpreter, used to such scenes, explained the boy has to return. The mother and other boy can stay, but this one has to go back to Poland. Raziel began to shriek and tear at her dress, while every other mother and father in the waiting room pressed forward with their hands at their hearts, their throats, knowing that at any time this could happen to them. Yakov's mother was in a painful dilemma. What to do? Her choice was simple, yet terrible: to return with Yakov and perhaps never see her husband, Shimson, again. Worse, to let Yakov return alone to live with distant relatives, perhaps never to see him again. Chanah broke free from Benjamin's clutch, ducked beneath the railing, and again approached the inspector's bench. This time, one of her black stockings had fallen to her high-top shoes, but she made no move to pick it up. "He knows everything," she said. "He can tell you what you had for breakfast this morning and what you had for lunch. Ask him." "The boy is entitled to an appeal," said the interpreter to the inspector. "You and I both know that can include the testimony of either relatives or lawyers." "We can't afford a lawyer," shouted Yankel. Suddenly weary, the inspector's shoulders sagged. "All right," he said. "Tell him to tell me what I had to eat today." Chanah asked Yaakov. Yaakov, in turn, made hand motions at Chanah that Chanah interpreted. "He said you had sausage and bread for lunch, with coffee to drink and eggs for breakfast." "I'll be," said the inspector. "How did he do that?" Chanah confirmed with Yaakov. "He smells the sausage on your breath and sees the coffee on your teeth, the breadcrumbs on your beard, and the eggs on your mustache." The inspector cocked an eye. He reminded Chanah of a rooster that used to strut in the neighbor's yard. "How does he know that I didn't have the eggs for lunch?" "Because the egg on your mustache is dry. If you had had it for lunch, the pieces would still be damp." The two men looked at each other while the others held their breath. Then the inspector winked at the interpreter. "I say we let in a kid with a sore throat. No translation was needed." The smiles told it all. When the inspector stamped a landing permit for Yaakov, Yaakov's mother grabbed his hand and kissed it. "Oh, now," said the inspector, "don't be making me out to be some saint." Then he became all business. Next he shouted, "We haven't got all day," as another family with patient, hopeful eyes came forward, bringing their belongings on their backs and their children in their arms. Chanah's family last stop before they took the return ferry was the money exchange booth. Yankel decided to cash only one gold coin and save the other for emergencies, which, in a family, come along at a fearsome rate. Besides, he reasoned, paper money can tear, paper money can burn, paper money can go out of fashion if one's country loses a war, but a gold coin, you cannot even bite into a gold coin. Yankel made another choice, one that cost him some of his money. A boat was available to take them directly to New Jersey. The uncle wanted to be sure that his cousin Simpson's family were safely met. He would take the ferry with them to New York City. It would cost him extra, a few pennies, he thought. What did it matter? If he and his entire family, including Yaakov, could make it safely through the inspection at Ellis Island, earning money would be easier than slapping a potato pancake on a griddle. The family ran from the shelter of their pier to the streets and back again, looking for Simpson. If the docks of New York City were a confusion, the streets beyond were more so. With horse-drawn carriages, cable cars whirring from overhead tracks, and once in a while, when one could take one's eyes from the tops of the tall buildings, a true wonder, a horseless carriage. Uncle decided that they were better off waiting under the shelter of the pier. Sooner or later, Simpson would find them. Uncle led them to an exit ramp off the ferries, where they stood rooted like trees among a horde of immigrants heading for the crowded streets. Some were vaguely familiar, some they knew, like the German couple who stopped to say goodbye. The father carrying their chair carved with lions, the mother proudly holding their new baby with a red ribbon pinned to her swaddling shawl. As the waiting grew tiresome, Chanah and her family sat on their bundles until Yaakov suddenly began flicking each side of his waist and pointing excitedly to someone in the crowd. "Look!" shouted Chanah. "Yaakov is making the fringe on his father's prayer shawl." Then Simpson appeared, excusing himself as he pushed through the crowd, looking exactly like an American. Yankel said it was his beard, which had been shaved off. Rick said It was more likely his suit of clothes, made of first-class American material. Jimson shouted Brazil, who had not seen her husband in 2 years. Papa, shouted Shmuel, who bolted clumsily on his fat, stubby legs. Yakov ran smiling and silent, flicking his hands at his waist. Jimson was all good news. He had a job in the garment industry, an excellent one. He was a pants presser. In fact, he had jobs lined up for every member of his family. Brazil would sew at home while he would take the boys, both of them, to the shop, where Shmuel would sweep and Yakov would pull threads. "Why can't I pull threads?" complained Shmuel. Why wasn't he the one to sweep? Jimson paid no attention to his older son and turned to Yankel. "Stay in New York," he advised. "With all the family working, you will be able to put aside some money." "I don't think so," replied Yankel. "I have made up my mind to go to New Jersey." Rifki whispered in his ear. "Besides," added Yankel, "my children will go to school." "The girl, too?" asked Jimson, with some surprise. Yankel wanted to say, "Especially the girl, especially after what she did this day for your son." But such comments would make Benjamin feel unworthy. Instead, he said, "Why not the girl?" While Jimson gathered his family's belongings, assigning to each a parcel to carry, Yakov pulled his hat over one eye and looked over his shoulder. Chanah turned and recognized the woman from third class standing alone in the throng, like a pebble in a stream only feet from where they stood. Chanah approached the woman timidly. "There you are," said the woman with a great sigh. "I was getting ready to let it go." "Let what go?" asked Chanah, wondering if she meant the feather. "See for yourself." The woman handed Chanah her blue flower-printed hat box. Scratching sounds could be heard coming from inside. "Go on," said the woman. "Open it." Chanah carefully lifted the lid off the hat box. Inside was a scrawny, tired-looking, unhappy cat. Chanah bent down, tears shining in her eyes, picked up the creature, and held her to her chest. "Pitzel! I thought I would never see you again," she crooned. "And a fine mess it made of my box," said the woman. "I can never use it again, I can tell you that." And Yankel came shouting through the crowd. "There you are! Didn't I tell you to never leave our side? Never! Your mother is beside herself. Why would you give us such a fright?" Chanah wiped the tears that streamed down her face. "Look, Papa," she said, "the lady kept her for me." "What was I to do?" said the woman. "The creature followed me to my cabin. It must have been the smoked fish I had wrapped inside a napkin. Once it was inside, there was the problem of getting rid of it. I didn't want anyone to think it belonged to me, so I hid it in my hat box, which I might add will never be the same." "Thank you," said Chanah, with English. "What did she say?" asked the woman. "She spoke English," replied Yankel, "and she said thank you, as I do." "Is anyone meeting you?" he asked. "My sister and her husband. They were supposed to be here 2 hours ago. I decided that as long as I was waiting for them, I would watch to see if you came out. If they don't show up," he said, "you are welcome to come with us to New Jersey. We are going to a farm community where there is work for all who want it and plenty of room." "Heaven forbid," she said. "I grew up on a farm. I have no intention of going back to one, especially in a place I had never heard of. Besides, I will soon have my own apartment." Just then a woman yelled, "There she is, looking like a greenhorn," and a couple broke from the crowd to wrap the woman from third class in a warm embrace. The man picked up her baggage and they led her away while the woman said, "You can't sleep on the couch. Stan's cousin is sleeping there, but we made a bed for you in the kitchen." Rifk had been standing behind Yankel's shoulder. "No one wants to go with us to New Jersey," she said. "Maybe they know something we don't." She forgot about New Jersey when they saw the cat. Cats carried typhus, ringworm, and heaven knows what else. They were even known to suck the breath from a sleeping baby. Rifk put her hands on her hips. "No cat," she said. Then Benjamin did something he seldom did. He put in a good word. "Cats also kill mice, Mama," he said. and there are a lot of mice in the country. Raziel also intervened. Rifk, if it wasn't for Chanah, I hate to think what would have happened today. Tante Mima had the last word. Let the child have her cat, she said, so we can go and I can get off my feet. Rifk, outnumbered, gave in. All right, she said, but not in the house. She turned to Yankel. We are going to have a house, aren't we? There will be a house, replied Yankel. He did not add, maybe not today. Neither did he say, maybe not tomorrow. All he said was, in this country, everything is possible. With tears and promises to write and visit, Chanah and her family said goodbye to Shimson, Raziel, and Shmuel and Yaakov and boarded the ship for New Jersey. Chanah stood at the railing with the basket partially open so Bitzel could feel the sea breeze on her face. The cat, who seemed to know that all was going reasonably well, poked her head out of the basket and sniffed the salt air. That's some terrible-looking animal, said Rifk to the Yankel. I wouldn't worry, said Yankel. In New Jersey, you will not be able to tell her from an American cat. Mark my words. Then Tante Mima, too weary to stand, sat on her baggage. This is positively the last boat they'll ever get me on again. I may be an old lady, but I can still put my foot down. What does it mean, Bubby? Asked Chanah. To put your foot down. It means to be stubborn. It means to say yes or no and mean it. Like what you did today for your cousin. You put your foot down. They listened. Tante Mima bent over to pull up Chanah's stocking. Chanah, Chanah, she said, what a little woman you are going to be.